Hello, and welcome to Books in the World. I'm delighted today to be here with Emily Franklin, who is the author of The Lioness of Boston. And she's a first-time guest on Books of the World, which happens to be the oldest long-running TV-produced show just for author interviews. It's been produced for over 45 years. So the Cape Cod Writers Center, which is even older than that, has managed to be doing this program since probably the birth of cable TV. And the goal of the program is to give authors experience and to showcase their work in the greater Boston area. So welcome, Emily. You are to be congratulated about this book. I'm going to tell people a little bit about your bio. Emily is the author of more than 20 novels and poetry collections, a poetry collection called Tell Me How You Got Here. Her award-winning work has appeared in the New York Times, Boston Globe, Guernica, JAMA, numerous literary magazines, as well as longlisted for the London Times Short Story Award. The Lioness of Boston is Emily's first historical novel, and it's about Isabella Stewart Gardner, who lived from 1840 to 1924. I like to be sure people understand the time period that we're in, especially since it's a historical novel. And it brings us, and the Gilded Age, it brings it all alive. Before we start talking to Emily, let me read one of the reviews from the back of her new book, this beautiful Lioness of Boston, very impressive book. The Lioness of Boston shows the deft touch of Edith Wharton and the delightful pomp of the Gilded Age. It's a book both elegant and entertaining, one to savor line by line, even as it carries us forward on the spirit and audacity of the narrator. Emily Franklin has rendered Isabella Stewart Gardner a classic literary heroine, one who emerges from heartbreak and defiance to shape her own life and the culture of an entire city. So, Emily, Timothy Shafford wrote that, the author of The Perfume Thief. How does it feel to hear words like that?
Oh, it feels great. It's so nice to have other authors who I respect so much really understand the material and have it resonate with them. So it's great.
Yeah. Did you ever know you'd be compared to Edith Wharton?
I did not know that, but I think, given the time period and Isabella Stewart Gardner's wit, or at least the wit I've imbued her with, it makes sense. It's a lovely parallel. So I'll take it.
You'll take it, and anyone who likes Edith Wharton would certainly like this. I think your book is a lot easier to read than Edith Wharton. Maybe it's because of the times are different, but I know this comment came up with reading what people have said about your book, and you've even said, even though this is deeply historical, we're going to talk about your research process and all of that. It's a good read. It's easy to follow along. It's a delight, I must say. Thank you very much for doing it that way.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I try hard. I mean, whether it's with my poetry or with historical fiction, I try to take even very complex ideas or thoroughly researched information and try to distill it down so it still feels exciting and palatable. So it doesn't feel like you're plodding through, this thick historic stuff that you start to lose the desire to keep moving forward, or you lose the character development. I really wanted to stay clear with that.
So another commentator, Dawn Tripp, who wrote the wonderful book about Georgia O'Keeffe, another historical novel, mentioned that your book contributes to Isabella Stewart Gardner's legacy in meaningful ways. Have you given that any thought?
It's very meaningful to me because I feel and I felt while writing a certain amount of duty to this person who existed that I'll never meet, that none of us will ever meet, but who contributed such a large amount of history and excitement to Boston and to the role of women in the arts. And so the fact that Dawn is sort of suggesting that this book will be part of Isabella's legacy and the study of what she contributed to the world is really meaningful to me.
I thought it was very insightful, and I can understand how you might have um, absorbed that. I mean, I absorbed it as a reader, thinking, "Yeah, wow, that's interesting."
Yeah,
So,
and that was certainly part of my goal, which was, again, I think people might know about the museum, and certainly people in the Boston area, and obviously people who travel internationally to come see this special place, but so much was known about the museum, but not about her. And so the fact that I can try to shine a light onto the life that she lived and share that information with people has been really pretty extraordinary.
you have talked about going to the museum and how that might have instigated your interest in her. And I have to say, too, when I moved to Boston some 30 years ago, but going there, I remember thinking, this woman has something, the fact that she knew all these people and she engaged in such a life, and that it was as controversial as it was, is like grabbed me immediately. Like, and I guess I've never really found out about her until now in this sense. Um, which kind of might lead to one of the questions that I've had about how do you develop the personality, or how did you develop Isabella this way, the way you do in this book?
Well, it's interesting because there are these anecdotes that we know about Isabella. People might have heard a rumor that she walked lions down Commonwealth Avenue, or they might know that she, you know, loved the Red Sox and she went to a Red Sox game with wearing her Victorian hat with OU Red Sox on it. And she sort of did these scandalous things. And we know that, and we know some of the tragedies that she experienced in her life. And they are sort of spoilers for the book, so I'll try to stay away from some of the details, but she really did experience a lot of personal loss. So when I was creating her character on the page, I was trying to blend sort of the person we knew her to be towards the end of her life, having opened this incredible museum. She was the first woman in America to open a museum. And she was this rejected young girl when she was first married and moved to Boston. So I had to figure out this journey that she took and then try to figure out what the character arc might be. And think about the fact of what I did know. She didn't leave a lot of journals or diaries and things like that. So a lot of it was very nice for me because I got to create so much. But part of it was really trying to spend some time thinking, what we know she left was this museum where nothing can ever be moved or changed, or Harvard gets everything, right? So if one thing is changed, Harvard gets everything. So who makes a place like that? What kind of person does that? And what must they have experienced? And how did they see the world? And then you combine that with early tragedy and rejection and privilege and a beautiful eye for art and this empathic sort of soul who definitely befriended people who existed at society's edges. And you begin to sort of say, like, okay, I think I can see how this person might take a shape on the page. And I sort of went from there.
So start with where the book starts, where they're building her house on Beacon Street, and she decides that she wants to design the tile walkway, and that becomes your opening scene with her. Tell us a little
Right.
bit about that.
Well, I wanted to have an introduction to somebody who sees the world in a different way, and a way that really isn't what women in her class ought to have been doing. So, it might have been one thing if she had thought to herself, well, wouldn't it be nice if I could have a say in how these bricks are laid out to the path to my house? But I probably shouldn't say anything because that's not really my place. But she never listened to that voice of what she should do. She just decided to say things. And instead of just expressing it on the page, I have her not just express it to her husband and to the architect, but actually I wanted to show the reader how out of the box she was thinking. And I have her get down on her hands and knees in her Victorian outfit and arrange the bricks on the path, because she has this idea of why shouldn't she have a say in this path to her house that she knows she's going to be walking for decades and decades, starting off as a young woman, and then she's imagining having a family there and eventually growing old with Jack there. So she's on her hands and knees, getting very filthy with her white gloves, getting all dirty, which is very embarrassing to her husband and shocking to the architect. And for the reader, I think it gives them a taste of the Isabella Stewart Gardner that's lurking inside, that's, you know, really not going to be able to stay contained into her small Victorian frame.
Yeah. Well, I bring that anecdote up because it's just illustrative of everything that happens to her in that early period. She's rejected by society, which is kind of odd, I thought, in a way, since she came from wealth. Um, but it was New York wealth, and that apparently didn't go over too well in Boston.
Well, yes, and I think it was the combination of New York wealth and sort of more than that even. You know, she had taken Jack Gardner off the market, and he was one of Boston's beloved Brahmin sons, and she was not one of the Brahmin daughters, so she was really not who they were hoping, that not who Boston society was hoping would marry Jack Gardner. And Isabella spoke her mind, so she didn't play the social game that everybody was supposed to play who was in her sort of social circle. And on top of that, when she was, you know, a couple of years earlier, she would come to Boston, and she was a bit of a flirt. And Boston had a very long memory for her social missteps. And I don't think Isabella Stewart, who she was at the time before Isabella Stewart Gardner, she did not really understand that if you dance with the wrong person, or you know, flirt with somebody, that people will remember, and you'll continue to be scandalized by your own behavior. And so that really plagued her for a long time.
So, how do you know you got it right, that this is what she was like, or does it matter when you're writing
Well,
historical fiction?
you know, if you lined up 100 novelists and everybody wrote a historic novel about Isabella Stewart Gardner, every novel is going to be different. This is my lens on Isabella and my take on her, with all of my research and all of the psychology that I was delving into. This was really my idea, that she was this woman who was ahead of her time, sort of a feminist before feminism, somebody who had been deeply wounded by her tragedies and her losses, and then really was able to turn that tragedy and that rejection into this powerhouse of tapping into her intellectual capabilities, largely because of Charles Eliot Norton, who's the first professor of art history at Harvard, who opens up her world, and she begins to go to lectures. And when she realizes that she has a skill, which is really finding out which art is beautiful and meaningful to her, and bringing art to the public, which was her personal mission. You know, this is my lens on her. And so do I think I got it right? I think I got it right for this novel. And I think from everything that I can gather, this is, the letters I've received from people, this was sort of the novel that people were waiting to read about her, and sort of staying true to the vision and the spirit that we all sort of think of when we think of Isabella Stewart Gardner, which is a careful mix of sort of tenderness and sadness with this hope and vivacity and intellectual determination and quirkiness and all of those things. And so all I can do is stay true to the vision that I had researched and created. And then also, if somebody else writes another novel about her in 10 years, it might illuminate something different.
I'm not doubting you. Knowing that she was associating with Charles Eliot Norton was an interesting part of all of this. I know some people know more about that era than others, and then the fact that was it Longfellow who was translating Dante with Norton, I think, at the time. Um, this was the peak of the intellectual life of Boston. As far as associating with with intellectuals, there's an interesting collection of women that she became friends with, who were neighbors, and was it Julia Ward Howe?
Julia Ward Howe, and who wrote
Yeah,
Battle Hymn of the Republic, and Yeah.
Yeah, she managed to find people, or people found her. So even though she was rejected from society for wearing blue shoes at one point, I think was one of your anecdotes that, she just couldn't do anything right as far as that inner circle was concerned.
That's true. But she winds up, making this beautiful found family of friends for herself. A lot of artists, a lot of people who, might have been overlooked by society, and, men and women, of all different classes who really spoke to her. And she made this beautiful group of them. And there are great photographs of her actually on the lawn of the place in Brookline of Green Hill. And she's sort of spread out on the lawn, and the people are around her seated and having a great time. You can tell that everyone's laughing. And
Henry James, tell us more about her friendship with Henry James.
She and Henry James, one of the things you can read are there are tons of letters that they exchanged, and there are about 40 years of letters that you can still read that they exchanged. And they just had a great connection because they're both very wry, very smart, very funny, and real social observers. And sort of Henry James had one foot in the British world and one foot in the American world, and observing society, but also out of society a bit. And, Isabella had one foot in society and one foot out of society. And so they just had such a fun friendship. And that was really fun to write about. All of the letters in the book are my own creation. I didn't, most letters didn't exist anyway, but I only wanted to make up the letters. I didn't want to take other people's words. But those were really fun to write just because Henry James was so funny, and Isabella, I think, appreciated his humor, and he made her funnier, and she, appreciated his wry sense of humor. So it's really fun.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about art. And maybe you can fill in what happened in Isabella's life after she started traveling with her husband for various reasons and started meeting artists in Europe. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, sure. So she, did experience this loss, as I said, and she was profoundly depressed. And the doctor in Boston suggested to Jack that, you should take your wife to Europe, and maybe that will make her feel better. And so she did go to Europe, and on that trip she began to see art. She did see Titian's Rape of Europa in Paris, and she did think to herself, I would like to own that one day, which is sort of a funny thing. And that's not the only time she ever thought that. There are a couple of different paintings that she would see and think, I would like that. But before she collected art, and before she met artists, Charles Eliot Norton, who she met through another Harvard scientist whose name was Theodore Lyman. He was somebody who was in a big sledding party that she had attended in Boston. And one of her flirting escapades, I will say, that worked to her favor because she stayed in touch with Ted Lyman, who was a Museum of Natural History scientist. And in the novel, she goes to visit him at the Harvard Museum of Natural History, which is pretty neat. But he introduces her to his cousin, and that's Charles Eliot Norton. And Charles Eliot Norton is really the first person, and really in particular the first man, who says to Isabella that he believes that her intellect, is being overlooked. And would she not consider, going to lectures and maybe collecting rare books? So what she first collected were these incredible rare books, everything, from Dante to Bibles to various poetry collections. And then from that, she began to collect art and want to meet the artists behind the work. Obviously not Titian, but she met other people, and she would often sponsor young artists, and really had an artistic sensibility about her, although she was not an artist herself. But she became very good friends with John Singer Sargent, who, was at the time John Singer Sargent had been really bred to be a sort of portrait artist for the elite, for the society people. And he too had his own social misstep. He had done quite well in his career. and was painting all the society people in Europe. And then he painted a French person's daughter with a very low cut dress. And that derailed his career. And so when Isabella first met him, he was still sort of recovering from that. And they became friends, and he winds up painting Isabella's portrait a number of times, which was really fun to write about in The Lioness of Boston, both because John Singer Sargent had a very particular way of painting, which was fun to describe, and they had this very interesting, intimate friendship revolving around the portraiture. And then she also met lots of other artists. She went to the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, and she discovered Anders Zorn there. He's a Swedish painter, and that's who did the portrait of her sort of in Venice when she's in the doorway, and there's sort of almost looks like fireworks behind her, and she's in a white dress, and she's just glowing with happiness and has really found her footing in the world. And so, yeah, she had lots of art.
She supported Sargent when he was censured, and also his painting of her was considered rather scandalous at the time.
It was,
and dress with the plunging neckline.
But also the pearls were plunging down in a way that was very suggestive. And then it was first on display at Jack's club, and actually he was so offended and so upset by that, even though Sargent was thrilled, and Isabella actually really liked the portrait, that out of respect to her husband, she asked that the portrait be taken down and never shown again until after her husband died.
So you portray her husband as being rather tolerant, although he didn't really understand her. Is that accurate? Or he didn't approve of her, even he might have understood her.
All I can do is sort of infer from what I know, which it seems like Jack Gardner was a very steady presence for her, that he clearly must have been taken with her and her, vibrant personality and her quirkiness and her outspoken nature. I'm sure that appealed to him. And I'm sure that his steadiness and, calm, unshakable, personality appealed to her. Now, like any marriage, it's partially about tolerance over such a long period of time. And I suspect that she probably was a little lonely when he was going off to the club all the time and leaving her. And I suspect that he was also a little mortified by her, outspokenness and some of her escapades later in life. But at the same time, they stayed married and devoted to each other. And I know that she was very sad and very distraught when he died. So I think it was a combination of admiration and tolerance from both of them.
Well, would you like to talk a little bit more about the museum? The fact that she famously said she doesn't want anything moved ever. Can you describe that emotion, how she placed things?
I mean, it's such a fascinating place because, it's not just paintings and sculptures, it's plates and vases and perfume bottles and a lock of Robert Browning's hair and books and so many chairs. There's so many objects there, but she really arranged everything, not just in her house, the way that she would have used them, but in a way that she wanted everybody to experience a work of art that she made out of everybody else's works of art. And so I actually had somebody in a reading ask me if I thought that she was sort of narcissistic in saying nothing should be moved. And I sort of thought about it, and I thought, wait a minute, how would we all feel if somebody came into our house and said, oh, actually, I'm going to move your chair over there. I don't want that table there. And, I don't want those family photographs there. We're going to put them on that other wall. We all like our things where we want them. We make our houses as an expression of ourselves, if we're fortunate enough to have them. And so I think that Isabella both had a vision of how she wanted everything displayed and really didn't want the unpredictable nature of something that might be moved. When you feel that your life is out of control, you like things to stay exactly the way that you've planned them. And I think some of the losses that Isabella suffered really made her feel out of control. So she wanted to just make sure that everything was the way that she left them. And then in terms of her mission, you know, she really did have this mission of bringing art to the public. That was what she wanted to do. So she didn't build the museum as a vanity project. She built it so that Boston would have this incredible amount of art. She has over 7,500 works of art on display for the public. And so I think she wants it like that. Now, obviously, with the heist in 1990, the empty frames that are still hanging there are part of the way that she structured her will. So those can't be taken down either, because they're both a reminder of, you know, hoping for the safe return of the artwork, and they can't be moved because Isabella hung those frames and she wants them there. And for me, those empty frames were a huge part of why I ended up writing this book, which was I was on a field trip in 1990 with my high school class. And I sat in the Dutch room and I wrote a paper on Storm in the Sea of Galilee and the concert. And then 10 days later, those paintings were cut from their frames. And so I was really carried around the idea of those empty frames for years, and thought about how, because they're still hanging, we can't forget about what happened. And I think that Isabella didn't want anybody to forget about her or what she had experienced or anything that had happened, both to her, her life, her art. Everything she collected, you know, has a story. Everything has a meaning behind it. And she really wanted to share all of that with people who come to the museum. And here it is hundreds of years later, and it worked.
I think anybody who goes to the museum is going to read this book, or if they read the book, they're going to the museum. It brings the place so alive. There's a wonderful information in your book about her description of art and memory, descriptions of the artwork, the times, the fact that she put that museum in the Fens, which wasn't even filled in yet at that point, or she had a lot to do with developing that land.
I mean, everybody thought she was crazy for doing it. It was part of the Emerald Necklace, you know, Olmsted's vision, but there was nothing there. It was just a wild, sort of swampy nature area. And she thought, well, that sounds like a great place to build a giant Venetian mansion, you know. So nobody understood that. But now, of course, we think, wow, she was so brilliant and ahead of her time.
Yeah, yeah. So in the case of doing this kind of research, how long does it take to pull everything together?
You know, about several years. But the way that my writing and research works is I start off researching very heavily, and the writing is just a little bit, and then they begin to do this. And so right now with the new book, I am still researching, but I definitely have the voice down. So I've begun to be writing in that, and then I'll go back and supplement with more research. But once I have the voices down, it's pretty fun.
Emily, would you believe we are out of time? And I want to thank you tremendously for sharing your thoughts with us, with our audience. If you'd like to know more about Emily's other work, you can visit her website, www.emilyfranklin.com. And also, for more Books in the World interviews, please look at the Cape Cod Writers Center website, www.capecodwritercenter.org, and happy reading. Goodbye.